Assignment 13 focuses on some psychological principles that are enormously important to how we visually communicate. They have to do with how the brain specifically processes visual information, and there's a bunch of them. They start on page 48 of the Module 2 book, and the assignment doesn't come for quite some time afterwards. So if you look, there's 6 principles that we're specifically focused on. 5 of them appear before the assignment. The 6th one is listed just after the assignment area. So you need to look over each of them, and then basically you're going to pick and demonstrate using construction paper, scissors, and your glue stick 3 of these principles. What we do not want you to do is exactly duplicate the examples that are shown or the examples that I'm going to show you, but that you demonstrate your understanding of what the principle is by creating your own take on whatever it is. Similarity is all about creating a more complex image, message, or what have you than the component parts. The Statue of Liberty, which pretty much everybody is able to see is what's going on here, is made up of a series of different sized triangles that are placed in a particular fashion. They have a message beyond, hey, look at this group of triangles. The idea with similarity also allows you to introduce an anomaly. An anomaly is something that is different because of its size or color or shape or value or texture or fill in the blank. And the anomaly is the thing that breaks the pattern, that allows it to stand out in some way. So you can do similarity by including the anomaly or not. That's up to you. Continuation is how the brain is able to complete a shape that has been broken in some way. It has no difficulty reading the word space. It also has no difficulty following the swoosh behind the star, even though the swoosh only exists in that it cuts up the letters. So that's demonstrating in a couple of different ways. And what you're going to find with some of these Gestalt principles is that it's not cleanly any one. It may actually border between 2 different principles. That's fine. You're trying to demonstrate one primary Gestalt principle per example. Again, you're doing 3. The lines here, it's technically 4 separate lines. They happen to meet in a common point in the center. Our eye reads it as 2 lines, not 4 separate ones, because of that concept of continuation. Closure, the eye closes an open shape and reads it as a complete object, even though conservatively 30% of the panda is missing here. We have no difficulty in reading it as a panda. Hugely important for logo creation. Proximity is all about grouping. Things that are close together and are orderly are a unit. Things that are further apart are not. And that is a enormously useful concept going along. The easiest way of demonstrating proximity is to have examples of each. It doesn't have to be squares. It can literally be any shape. It's all in the grouping and how close they are together. Same thing is true of our flame. This would be 3 separate swooshy shapes, but because of the way that they're positioned and truthfully their similarity to each other, they read as a flame and not as 3 separate shapes. Figure and ground, used enormously by M.C. Escher, is all about finding the subject. And with some figure and ground examples, your eye is constantly switching between them. The elements that were added to this scene are the faces. The vase is the form that's formed by the 2 shapes, and it's a matter of which thing that you're looking at. Figure and ground doesn't always have to be that complex in terms of, in other words, you're not always looking at 2 forms, but you're finding the focal object somewhere in there using this combination of light and dark. Again, heavily used with logos too. So we're down to page 52. This is where the assignment happens, and it talks about doing 3, an A, a B, and a C. So you're doing 3 different Gestalt principles from the choices of the items above. a third of the page each. I've got an Illustrator document set up in mine, again, just for demo purposes. You're doing yours with construction paper, and I've already started on a variety of these. I've got a couple of different examples of what I might use for figure and ground. The first one is a black rectangle that I cut away parts of and form hopefully what is a clearly recognizable tree. The tree is actually the absence of information. The black part is the ground. The figure, in my case, is the tree, but I formed the ground or the figure, in other words, I formed the focal element by removing, and that becomes an important approach. Same kind of concept is true here with this graphic that I was trying for. Hopefully you can see that it's an eye, and it can work even with less information. In other words, if I remove this part, it may become even more clear. And as with the tree example on mine, it's about the part that I've taken away. And so the easiest one, if you want to start on this, or the easiest way you can approach it, is perhaps to cut out a rectangular shape and see what you end up with when you cut away pieces and sort of put it together. But you can do this other ways, or you don't even have to do figure and ground. The second one I have done that I want to show you, and so for this one, if I were turning it in, I would choose either the tree or the eye. You don't have to do both. And the other purpose that I'm trying to demo here is that it doesn't have to completely fill a third of your area, but it can. So I divided the page into the thirds, and maybe that's all I'm using in the figure and ground example. In the second version, I've put together this, and again, I'm doing something that y'all can't easily do with construction paper, but you would have your sizes as sort of a jumping off point before you cut them out. It's a series of elliptical shapes, but what I'm trying to represent with this series of elliptical shapes is a hand in terms of the angle, the placement, and in some small way the size that I'm using with these. And I tried to stick with pretty much straight up ellipses. I didn't want to change the form of any of these to see how cleanly I could communicate hand. And the other thing that I don't want to do is I actually don't want to embed them, because when you lose the gaps, you lose the fact that they are in fact separate objects. So try to see what you're able to make out of a series of other shapes and see how cleanly that concept can be communicated. And then I've got another example I want to show you next. I've drawn a heart, and this is something I want to show you in terms of closure. Right now, the shape is completely closed. There's no interpretation needed for this one. But what can, in fact, make this a good example of it is how much of this can I erase away and still read it as a heart. That's pretty clean. It's just an open spot there. What about here? Yeah, it's got an upper and lower component. So the eye doesn't really have any difficulty closing the gaps that are there. That's an example of closure. We've got some additional examples that sort of border a little bit on closure and a little bit on completion as well. And I just scooted everything over in mine because I've got a couple of these that I've done that do a little bit of both. I would say for the close one, it's a little bit more about completion. But also there's some continuation happening there. The black stripe that goes up the center of this shape could keep us from being able to cleanly read the text, but it's not enough to keep the text from being intelligible. The arrow on the end takes that from just being a black stripe and makes it into an arrow, and for many people, their eye is going to follow it straight through and continue all the way to the tip. So we've kind of got a couple of different things happening there. The eye is able, I guess this would be more continuation than closure, because there isn't really an open gap. We're having to separate out what we view as multiple shapes when they're sharing the same space, but that would work, etc., etc. So there's a lot of different ways that you could go with all of these. Another example with text is this one. Even though we have a descender, Most people are going to be able to read this pretty cleanly as open. This is a Gestalt principle. The eye is able to finish the shape even though the bottom of the shape has been concealed. The same thing would be true if this were in dark gray, meaning blending in with the background. We would still be able to read this word because our eyes can, in fact, do that completion activity and finish off and close the shape. So think about these kinds of approaches as you're going through and creating your Gestalt items. The idea overall is that you're going to end up with 3 different, I currently have 4, different examples in what you're turning in, and it's going to be your choice. The only thing that would be additional in terms of what you are submitting is right beside each one of the items that you're doing, which of the Gestalt principles you are trying to represent.